The laughter in the halls, the morning light, slid through the tall windows of the glass building, the kind of building that looked like power itself, with polished floors shining and voices echoing as workers rushed in, heels clicking and ties swaying. In the rush of another corporate day inside the towering company, people moved with purpose, but not everyone had the same dignity. Among them was a woman, carrying her broom and bucket, a woman in a plain uniform that marked her as invisible to most. Her name was Mary, and she was the maid who swept the corners when no one noticed and mopped the floors that reflected the pride of the company every day. Mary entered quietly, her shoes worn, her back tired, yet her eyes steady. She pushed her cart down the long halls where laughter often followed her, not laughter of joy but cruel laughter that clung to her presence. Whenever she passed by, whispers turned to smirks, smirks turned to mocking words, as if her very existence as a cleaning lady gave them permission to strip her of respect. The workers acted as though she was beneath them, as though her worth was less, because her job was to sweep their dust in. The break room, a group of employees sipped their coffee as Mary bent down, scrubbing a corner of the floor shining under her effort. One of them leaned toward another and whispered loud enough to be heard, "Imagine spending your life with a mop instead of a pen must be the highlight of her day." Another laughed, holding back nothing, saying, "Maybe one day she can mop her way into the CEO office," and they burst into laughter. Loud, cruel and sharp, like glass cutting through silence. Mary heard every word. She always did, but she never allowed her face to break. She had learned long ago to master silence. She had learned that to fight back with anger only gave them more to laugh at, so she swallowed the sting and let her hands keep working. But deep inside each word cut another wound she never showed, but always carried as the day went on. The whispers continued in the elevators, in the halls, in the conference rooms. The laughter spread like a habit. She was the target of easy mockery, and people joined in without guilt. They called her the ghost. With a broom they joked about her smell of cleaning chemicals. They laughed that she must be too poor to dream. She carried it all with quiet strength because she knew something they did not. She knew that storms are silent before they strike. It was during lunch hour when the cruelest joke came. As Mary walked past the cafeteria carrying her cart, a young manager leaned back in his chair and shouted, "Hey, Mary, when you are done mopping our floors, can you clean my future too, because it looks dirty and hopeless?" The room roared with laughter, hands clapping, tables shaking from the force of their joy. But none of it was joy. It was pure cruelty. She stopped for a moment, and her hand gripped the handle of her cart tight, her knuckles pale. She wanted to scream, she wanted to cry, but instead, she raised her head for the first time, her eyes calm and steady, as she stared at the man who had mocked her. The room went silent for a brief second, because something in her gaze unsettled them. It was not anger, it was not sadness, it was something else, something unshakable like steel beneath her skin. But she said nothing. She simply turned and continued her work, leaving behind a silence more powerful than any words outside the cafeteria. A few workers who had stayed quiet whispered to each other, uneasy. "She never talks back, but the way she looked at him, it felt like she knows something we don't." The other shrugged it off, but the seed of doubt had been planted. As Mary cleaned the long hallways, her thoughts wandered back to the day she first stepped into this building years ago. She remembered the way she promised herself she would endure. She remembered the long nights, working 2 jobs to raise her child. She remembered the sacrifices and the pain that carved her strength like stone. Now every insult was just another reminder that these people saw only what they wanted to see, but not who she really was. The afternoon sun turned golden as the halls emptied into quiet, the laughter fading with the workers gone. Mary leaned against her cart for a moment, her body aching, her mind heavy, yet inside her a flame grew, the kind of flame that no amount of cruelty could extinguish. She knew they thought of her as powerless, she knew they thought of her as invisible. But she also knew something they could never imagine. The day would come when the same voices that laughed at her would fall silent, when the same people who mocked her would stand frozen, unable to speak, when the truth of who she was would rise higher than the glass walls of this company. And, as she pushed her cart back into the janitor closet, locking the door behind her, she whispered, only to herself, "Let them laugh for now, because laughter is short but power lasts forever." Secrets behind the broom. The next morning arrived with the usual rush of footsteps and the hum of voices filling the building. The workers in polished shoes and pressed suits streamed in as though the world belonged to them. The scent of fresh coffee floated from The lobby cafe, the sound of laughter once again followed Mary as she wheeled her cart through the halls. The company carried on with its rhythm, but what none of them knew was that beneath the plain uniform she wore lay stories they could never imagine. Mary had lived many lives. Though they saw only the life of a maid, they never knew about the girl she once was, the one who had grown up with little but fought for everything she dreamed. They never knew about the scholarship she earned as a young woman, her sharp mind cutting through numbers and codes faster than anyone in her class. They never knew she had once been a brilliant student who stood on the edge of a future in technology before life tore it away when her mother fell sick and her dreams collapsed under the weight of hospital bills. She put away her books, traded keyboards for mops, and chose survival over recognition. Every sweep of her broom, every push of her cart carried more than cleaning supplies. It carried secrets of a woman who once solved equations at midnight, who once dreamed of building programs that would change lives, who once sat in lecture halls where professors whispered she was a genius in the making. She kept all of that buried because the world left her no choice. She had kept quiet for years, letting her brilliance fade behind walls of humility. But silence does not erase truth, it only hides it, and truth has a way of breaking through even the thickest walls. One afternoon, while cleaning an empty conference room, she noticed papers scattered across the table. Her eyes scanned the numbers across them, reports filled with errors, the kind of errors that no one else seemed to notice, and in that instant her mind awoke like a machine from sleep. She picked up a pen that had been left behind, and without hesitation began correcting the mistakes line after line, her hands moving fast, her mind calculating solutions with ease. It was as if the years of silence had not stolen her gift. She left the papers neatly stacked and slipped away unseen. But later that evening, when the department head came searching for who had fixed the possible errors, no one could answer. They did not know that the maid with the broom had done what their analysts could not. They dismissed it as a fluke, never imagining her. But the secret weighed heavier on Mary. She wanted to forget her past, but the past refused to let her go. Every time she touched a report left behind, every time she glanced at the charts glowing on computer screens, her mind lit up. Her skills refused to die. She knew then that one day the truth would find its way out. Still, she kept her silence. She returned home each night to her small apartment where the walls were cracked and the furniture old, but in that space she found peace. Her daughter Lily waited for her with a smile that erased the day's pain. Lily was young, full of hope, her eyes shining with questions about the world. She wanted to be a lawyer. She wanted to fight for justice, and Mary supported her dream with everything she had, no matter how hard the work, no matter how cruel the laughter she endured because of Lily. But one evening, as Mary tucked her daughter into bed, Lily asked with innocent curiosity, "Mama, why do people laugh at you when you work? Are they blind? Don't they know you are the smartest woman in the world?" Mary froze, her heart heavy, but her lips curved into a small smile. She brushed her daughter's hair and whispered, "Sometimes people cannot see past what is in front of them, but you must always know your worth, because one day the world will see it." The next day in the office, Mary moved through the halls as usual, but whispers began to shift. Some employees had noticed strange coincidences, problems solved, reports corrected, yet no one confessed to it. The same employees who mocked her now looked with faint unease when she passed, as if they sensed she knew more than she revealed. By late afternoon, the CEO himself entered the main hall, his voice booming, his presence heavy. He demanded to know who was responsible for the fixes in the financial reports. His anger flared, accusing his managers of sloppiness. But beneath that anger was fear that someone inside the building knew things they should not. Mary watched from a distance, silent, her eyes calm, but her mind racing because she understood more than anyone else in that room. She understood numbers and codes in ways that even the CEO could not imagine. That night Mary stood at her small kitchen table with old notebooks spread before her. She had kept them hidden all these years, covered in dust, but still filled with calculations, algorithms, and programs she once dreamed of building. She flipped through them, her fingers tracing the faded ink. As her resolve grew, she whispered to herself, "One day the truth will rise. They think I am nothing, but I am more than they will ever know." Days turned into weeks, and slowly her secrets began to push their way into the light. Every mistake that company made, every overlooked number, every faulty plan, Mary corrected them quietly, leaving behind no name, no trace. But her work spoke louder than any title. The whispers grew louder, managers uneasy, directors questioning. Yet none dared imagine the truth. One Friday afternoon, as the office buzzed with talk of weekend plans, a storm of crisis hit the company. A major contract error had been discovered, worth millions. Panic swept through the halls. Managers scrambled, papers flew, and voices rose in fear. But while they drowned in chaos, Mary stood silently in the corner, her eyes on the numbers flashing across the screen. She knew the solution instantly, her mind sharper than any of theirs, but still she kept her silence. For now she watched them crumble, she watched their confidence turn to fear, and in that moment she realized the power she held. Her broom was only a mask, her uniform only a costume. Behind it all, she was something greater, something they could never mock again. She carried secrets that would soon tear open the walls of their arrogance and reveal a storm none of them could escape. And as she left that evening, walking past the glass doors with the city lights glowing outside, she whispered to herself, their laughter is fading. Soon they will know the truth behind the brum. The CEO's cruelty. The company towered over the city like a monument of power, its glass walls reflecting the sunlight, as though nothing inside could be touched by weakness. But beneath the shine, the halls carried whispers and unease, because something unusual had begun to stir. The mysterious corrections, the quiet solutions, problems vanishing without explanation had made managers nervous and directors restless. Yet instead of looking deeper, they laughed it off or blamed one another. But there was one man who did not laugh. He was the CEO, the ruler of this empire, a man named Richard, whose word was law. Inside those walls, Richard was tall, broad-shouldered, his suits expensive, his watch gleaming, but his heart was sharp with arrogance. He had built his name on fear and control. He believed no one could challenge him, and no one ever would. To him the workers were pawns, the managers disposable, the cleaners invisible. He moved through the building with the air of a king, and when he heard of mysterious fixes in his reports, his fury ignited, not because the problems were solved, but because they were solved without his command. A Tuesday morning, Richard stormed into the main hall, his footsteps striking hard against the polished floor. Silence followed in his wake. Employees turned their heads, eyes wide, afraid of his glare. He summoned the managers, demanded answers, his voice booming. Who dares touch my work without permission? Who thinks they are smarter than me? He slammed the reports onto the glass table, and the sound echoed through the halls. No one spoke. They shifted nervously, eyes down, hearts pounding, because Richard's temper was known across the company. Marie stood in the corner, her cart beside her broom, leaning against the wall. She was there to clean the floor, but her ears caught every word. She watched the way the managers trembled, and the way Richard's face burned with rage. His words cut like knives, and the silence of the room only fueled his cruelty. Then it happened. Richard's eyes fell on Mary. She was simply standing still, holding her mop, but her calm presence irritated him like a thorn in his pride. He smirked, and his voice turned cruel. So here is our ghost with the broom. Maybe she is the one correcting reports for us. Maybe the maid thinks she is smarter than the men in this room. Laughter erupted from the crowd, eager to please him, eager to avoid his wrath. The sound of it filled the hall, cutting through Mary's chest. She stood frozen, her hand tight around the handle of her cart, her heart pounding in her ears, but her face betrayed nothing. Her silence had always been her shield. Yet this time something different burned inside her, because Richard had dragged her into the fire in front of everyone. He had mocked her, not in whispers, not in passing, but in the open, under the eyes of the entire company, and she felt the sting of humiliation crawl across her skin. Laughter grew louder, echoing down the glass walls, but as Mary raised her head, slowly the sound faltered. Her eyes locked on Richard, calm, unblinking, strong, the kind of gaze that unsettled even the most arrogant man. For a moment, the room fell silent. Uneasy, Richard shifted slightly, but covered it with a laugh, thinking he had broken her, thinking she was too small to matter. He turned his back, dismissing her as nothing more than air. Mary returned to her cart, her hands steady, but her heart burning deep inside her. Memories rose of the sacrifices she made, the intelligence she buried, the nights she worked until her body ached, the mornings she endured, cruel words for her daughter's future, and now to be mocked by a man who thought he ruled the world. It ignited something she had kept locked away. She told herself this humiliation would not end in silence forever. That afternoon, Richard called for an emergency meeting. He gathered his board, his managers, his assistants, and he made it clear he wanted the mysterious fixer found. He could not bear the idea that someone in his empire was working behind his back. He spoke of loyalty, he spoke of power, but underneath his words was fear. He needed control, and anything he could not control enraged him. His cruelty sharpened with every moment of uncertainty. The meeting raged. Mary moved silently through the building, her eyes catching every glance, her ears catching every whisper. She knew the walls of arrogance were cracking. She knew Richard was desperate to protect his throne, yet he did not know that truth was already in his building, walking among his workers, sweeping his floors, holding her silence like a weapon, waiting for the right moment. As the sun set, Richard returned to his office at the top floor of the city. Glowing beneath him, he poured himself a glass of whiskey, staring out at the skyline, convinced of his own greatness. Yet in the back of his mind, the image of the maid's calm eyes lingered. Why did her gaze disturb him? Why did he feel as if she knew something he did not? He shook the thought away, drowning it with another drink. But fear is not so easily silenced. It grows in the corners of corners, like shadows in light down below. Mary finished her shift. She stored her cart and broom in the closet, but instead of leaving, she sat quietly on the bench outside the building, her thoughts heavy. She remembered the way Richard mocked her, the way the laughter spread like poison, but she also remembered the silence that followed. Her gaze, she remembered the unease in their eyes. She realized then that power was not always in the hands of those who shouted. Sometimes it was in the hands of those who endured. That night, as she walked home through the quiet streets, her mind turned sharper than ever. She knew Richard's cruelty was not just about her. It was about everyone in that building, everyone he belittled, everyone he crushed to protect his throne. She thought of the workers who lived in fear, the managers who bent their backs to survive, the assistants who cried in silence, and she thought of her daughter who deserved to grow up in a world where men like Richard could not laugh away the dignity of others. And in that thought her decision began to form. The next day, Richard called another meeting, this time with the entire staff gathered in the lobby. He wanted loyalty. He wanted to prove his strength. He stood on the staircase above them, his voice echoing like thunder. He shouted about respect for authority, about the cost of betrayal. His words sharp, his eyes filled with fire. And then he looked at Mary once again, his finger pointing down at her. The maid who thinks she can stand in my company. Maybe we should let her run it, since she seems so smart. The crowd laughed again, though weaker than before, the sound hollow. But Richard did not notice. He thrived on cruelty, his pride blind to the cracks forming around him. Mary lifted her head, her gaze steady, her silence deep. She gave no reply, only turned and pushed her cart away, leaving the hall in silence behind her. And for the first time the laughter felt uncertain, forced, because deep inside they all felt that something was coming, something stronger than Richard's cruelty. And in the quiet of her own home that evening, Mary whispered to herself, the time of silence is ending, the time of truth is near. He thinks he is untouchable, but every empire falls, and soon he will see the power of the one he mocks. The tables begin to turn. The morning broke with grey skies hanging over the city, a storm waiting to fall. And inside the towering glass building, tension buzzed like static in the air. Workers hurried through the halls, whispering in low voices. Something had shifted the day before, when the CEO mocked the maid in front of everyone. The laughter that once rolled freely had begun to sound weak, almost nervous, because though Richard laughed, the memory of Mary's silent, unflinching gaze lingered heavy in their minds. Mary moved through the building as she always did, pushing her cart, her uniform plain, her steps steady. But the eyes that followed her were different now, no longer filled with only mockery. Some held unease, others curiosity, and a few even shame. For the first time, they wondered if there was more to her than the broom in her hands. That morning brought chaos to the upper floors. The company faced a sudden crisis. The million-dollar contract with an international partner had fallen apart because of a hidden error in the figures. Panic spread like fire. The managers ran from office to office, voices raised, hands trembling, papers flying. They scrambled to save themselves, because they knew Richard's wrath would fall heavy upon them. Richard himself stormed through the boardroom, shouting, his face red, his fists slamming against the table. He demanded answers, demanded solutions. His pride burned because failure was something he could not accept. His empire was built on the illusion of perfection, and now that illusion cracked in front of everyone. As the managers stumbled and argued, Mary entered quietly to clean the edges of the hall. She was not meant to hear their words, but every voice carried to her ears. She listened to the numbers they spoke, the figures they could not reconcile, the projections that made no sense. Her sharp mind awakened at once. Her gift that never died leaped into motion in her head. She saw the errors, saw the missing logic, saw the path to fix it all. She leaned on her mop, her eyes narrowing as the solution formed line by line inside her mind. Richard screamed at his board, calling them fools and abuse, his cruelty sharp with every word, but beneath it his fear grew because he knew this disaster could bring him down, his fortune, his reputation, his throne, all at risk, and in that desperation he turned his fury outward, onto the very people he once relied on. Mary could not ignore what she knew any longer. Her silence had protected her until now, but she also understood that silence could not save the company from collapse. She moved closer, leaving her mop behind, her voice rising steady for the first time in that room. She said, "I know what the error is." The entire hall froze, every head turning toward her. The maid who never spoke had broken her silence. Richard's face twisted in disbelief and anger. He barked out laughter, sharp and cruel. "So the cleaning lady thinks she can save the empire." The room chuckled nervously. Though their laughter lacked strength, Mary stepped forward, calm, her eyes steady. She pointed to the charts projected on the screen, her words clear. "The mistake lies in the conversion of currency rates. You calculated with outdated values and ignored the revised trade tax. I can fix it and salvage the contract if you let me." Silence followed her words, heavy like thunder before lightning. Managers glanced at each other, wide-eyed, because it was right. Her explanation pierced through the fog of confusion, and in that moment many of them knew it, though none dared say it aloud. Richard's pride boiled his face. Dark, his voice thundered. "Who do you think you are to stand in my boardroom and tell me what to do? You are nothing but a maid. Your job is to clean floors, not speak of numbers." His cruelty lashed out sharp as a whip, but Mary did not flinch. She stood rooted, her eyes never leaving his. She repeated her words calm. "I can fix it." The silence stretched long, heavy, until one director at the far end spoke softly but firmly. "She is right. I checked those values last week, and her correction matches the missing piece." Richard turned his fury toward the man, silencing him with a glare, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Others shifted uncomfortably, realizing the truth stood in front of them, wrapped in a maid's uniform. Richard dismissed her with a wave of his hand, shouting for security to remove her. But before they could, the phones rang, alarms of investors demanding answers flooding in. The crisis, too real to ignore Mary's words, hung in the air, unshakable. He could not silence them completely, though he tried. By evening, the whispers spread through the building faster than fire. They spoke of the maid who corrected the board. They spoke of her calm voice in the storm. They spoke of her courage in standing before Richard himself. Suddenly, the laughter that once mocked her turned into murmurs of awe, confusion and fear, because no one had ever dared stand against Richard and remained standing that night. Mary returned home, her body tired but her heart alive. She sat at her kitchen table, her daughter Lily watching her with wide eyes. When Mary told her what happened, Lily smiled, her young voice filled with pride. "I always knew you were more than they could ever see." Mary felt tears sting her eyes, but she held them back, pressing a kiss to her daughter's forehead. She whispered, "One day, they will learn never to underestimate the unseen." The next morning, Richard entered the office with a storm in his heart, determined to crush the whispers and restore his control. He called another gathering, forcing Mary to stand before everyone. He mocked her again, accused her of lying, accused her of trying to embarrass him. He wanted to humiliate her until no one would dare believe her words. But something was different now. The employees who once laughed freely now watched in silence, their eyes shifting between him and her, their loyalty cracking, their fear of him clashing with the truth. They had seen. Mary stood tall, her voice steady as she replied, "I did not come to embarrass you. I came to save what you built, but you would rather destroy it than admit you are wrong." Her words cut through the room sharp as glass. No one laughed this time. The silence that followed was louder than any mockery. Richard clenched his fists, rage burning, but in that moment he felt something he had never felt before: weakness, because the control he thrived on was slipping. The workers no longer laughed at his jokes. They no longer echoed his cruelty. They began to see another kind of strength standing before them, a maid with nothing but truth in her hands. The tables had begun to turn, and though Richard fought it with all the arrogance in his soul, the shift was unstoppable, because once laughter fades into silence, it can never return the same, and once truth is spoken, it cannot be unheard. And as Mary left the hall that day, pushing her cart with calm, steady steps, the workers parted for her without a word, their eyes following her, not with ridicule but with quiet respect and fear of what she might reveal next. The invisible maid was invisible no more. The power she carried had begun to break through the glass. Walls of the empire, the maid's bold move. The storm that had been gathering within the walls of the company now reached its peak. The employees walked the halls with restless hearts. Whispers carried from one office to another about the maid who stood before the CEO and spoke truth when no one else dared. The same people who once mocked her now lowered their voices when she passed, and the sound of laughter that once followed her footsteps had been replaced with silence, uneasy and heavy. Like air before thunder, Richard, the CEO, burned with rage, his pride wounded by her defiance. He could not accept that a woman with a broom had dared to challenge him. In front of everyone, he spent his days shouting at managers, slamming doors, threatening firings, but his anger only exposed his weakness, because the more he tried to crush the whispers, the louder they became behind his back. He was no longer seen as untouchable, and that frightened him more than anything. Mary knew she had crossed a line that could never be undone. She knew Richard's eyes followed her now, not with disregard, but with fury, yet she did not waver. She had carried silence long enough, and her silence had been their shield, but now her voice had become her weapon. She began to notice the way workers looked at her, no longer with ridicule but with something close to hope. Some even dared nod at her as she passed, quiet signs that they saw her differently. Was during one sleepless night when Mary sat at her small kitchen table staring at her old notebooks filled with calculations and codes that she made her decision. She would no longer wait for chance or accident to reveal her strength. She would step forward on her own terms and force the truth into the open. The broom had been her mask, but now she would remove it. She would make her bold mover. Next morning, Richard called for another meeting, his voice thundering through the speakers, ordering every employee to gather in the grand hall. He wanted to crush the growing unrest. He wanted to prove he was still the king, and he wanted to humiliate Mary once and for all. The workers filed in, their faces pale with fear, knowing his temper could destroy lives. Mary too stood among them, broom in hand, cart by her side, silent but steady, her heart pounding with a storm she was ready to release. Richard climbed the stairs to the platform, his suit sharp, his watch gleaming, his eyes blazing with fire. He began to speak about loyalty, about betrayal, about the punishment that awaited anyone who dared undermine him. His words cut through the hall like knives, but they carried less weight than before, because the crowd had seen something he could not erase. They had seen truth stand before him, and he could not bury it under his anger. Then his eyes found Mary. He pointed at her, his voice dripping with venom. Here stands the woman who thinks she is greater than the rest of you. Here stands the maid who dares to correct my empire. Should I let her mop the floors, or should I let her lead the board? The laughter he expected did not come, only silence stretched heavy and sharp. Mary stepped forward slowly, her steps steady, each one echoing in the silent hall, her broom left behind her, voice rising clear and unshaken. You mock me because you fear me, she said, calm and strong. You fear that I know what you do. Not you fear that truth lives in the hands of the one you call nothing. She turned to the crowd, her eyes sweeping across them. And you follow his cruelty because you are afraid. But fear builds prisons, and laughter cannot hide chains. The hall was silent, every eye on her. Richard's face twisted with rage, but Mary continued, her voice stronger. I know the numbers that keep this company alive. I know the errors that eat away at your empire. I have fixed them quietly while you mocked me. I have carried the weight you could not see, and now I will no longer hide. She reached into her bag and pulled out copies of reports she had corrected over the past months, proof undeniable. She laid them on the table for all to see. The managers leaned forward, eyes widening as they realized every mistake, every crisis had been solved by her. Gasps filled the room, the weight of revelation crashing down like thunder. Richard's voice exploded, shouting lies and tricks. She forged them. She is nothing but a cleaner. But his words shook with desperation. The crowd saw it. They saw his fear for the first time. Mary did not flinch. She looked him in the eyes and said, you call me nothing, but I am the reason your empire still stands. You call me invisible, but I am the shadow that has carried your failures. You laugh at me, but today your laughter ends. The hall echoed with her words, steady, unbroken, powerful. The employees shifted uneasily, their loyalty cracking before their eyes. They saw not a maid, but a leader, not weakness, but strength. Richard shouted again, demanding silence, ordering security to take her away, but no one moved. The guards stood frozen, their eyes darting between him and her, because in that moment, authority no longer belonged to him. It had slipped through his fingers and landed in hers. Mary stepped closer, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through the air. You thought power was fear. You thought respect was control. But real power is truth, and real respect is earned through courage. You built this empire on fear, but I will not fear you anymore. The hall erupted, not in laughter, not in fear, but in silence, deeper than any before, a silence heavy with realization. The workers saw the cracks in Richard's throne. They saw the courage in Mary's stand, and they knew the tables had fully turned. The maid had made her bold move, and nothing would ever be the same again that night. As Mary walked home through the quiet streets, the city lights glowing around her, she carried no broom. She carried no cart. She carried only the weight of what she had done. She knew Richard would fight back. She knew the storm was far from over, but she also knew the silence was broken forever. Her bold move had torn open the walls of his empire, and the truth had finally stepped into the light. And as she entered her small apartment, her daughter Lily ran into her arms, asking, "Mama, what happened today?" Mary held her tight, her heart swelling with both pride and fear, and she whispered the truth. "My child, they mocked me, but today I stood, and tomorrow we will see what comes of it. But remember always, never let anyone tell you you are less than who you are." From mockery to respect. The morning after Mary's bold stand, the building no longer felt the same. The walls that once echoed with laughter at her expense now carried a silence heavy with thought. The employees walked through the halls in hushed voices, their glances shifting nervously between Richard's office and the janitor closet where Mary kept her cart. The fear that once bound them to Richard's authority had cracked under the weight of her truth, and though no one said it aloud, every person felt the shift. Richard arrived later than usual, his face pale, his jaw clenched, his pride shattered from the day before. Yet his arrogance would not let him admit defeat. He entered the boardroom with a thunderous stride, his eyes blazing. He demanded loyalty, he threatened firings, he promised punishments for anyone who dared betray him. But as he looked around the room, he felt it. Their silence was no longer obedience, it was resistance. His words that once commanded fear now rang hollow. Mary entered quietly to mop the floor, her presence unavoidable, and every head turned toward her. Richard's fury snapped. He slammed his fist on the table and shouted, "Enough of this nonsense. She is a cleaner, nothing more. She has no right to stand here. She has no power." But his voice cracked as he spoke. The strength that once silenced the room now fell short against the truth standing before him. Mary set her mop aside and lifted her head, her voice calm yet powerful. She said, "You built this empire on fear, but fear is not power, and fear is not respect. You mocked me and they laughed with you, but laughter fades, while truth remains. I have carried your failures, I have fixed your mistakes, and I have stood in silence while you crushed others, but I will be silent no longer." The managers shifted uncomfortably, some lowering their eyes, others staring at her with growing respect. Richard shouted again, calling her a liar. But before he could continue, one director stood slowly, his voice steady. "She is right. We checked her corrections, and without them this company would have collapsed weeks ago." Another voice rose, supporting her, then another, until the room that once laughed at her now spoke in her defense. Richard's face twisted, his arrogance collapsing under the weight of their words. He shouted for order, demanded obedience, but the chain of fear had broken. The workers no longer bowed to him. They turned instead toward Mary, their eyes filled with something he had never commanded, respect. Mary stepped forward, her eyes fixed on Richard, calm and unshaken. "You called me invisible, but now you cannot ignore me. You thought I was nothing, but I carried the strength you never saw. You built your throne on arrogance, but today that throne falls." She placed the stack of corrected reports on the table, each page proof of her work, each page a nail in the coffin of his Richard tried to speak, but the words failed. His mouth opened and closed, his hands trembled as he realized the truth. His power had slipped away, and no amount of shouting could bring it back. The room no longer belonged to him. The room belonged to the maid. He mocked. Silence filled the hall, but it was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of respect. Mary looked around at the faces that once sneered at her. She saw shame, she saw regret, she saw the beginning of change, and with a steady breath she said, "I do not stand here to humiliate anyone. I stand here to remind you all that dignity has no uniform and respect has no rank. Every person holds worth, no matter what title they carry, and if you ever forget that, you will lose more than contracts. You will lose your humanity." The words struck deep, piercing the hearts of those listening, and though some lowered their eyes in guilt, others lifted their heads with hope. For the first time they saw her not as a maid, but as a leader. Richard staggered back, his voice breaking. "You cannot fire me, you cannot take my place." But even as he spoke, the board members looked away from him, their silence louder. Then rejection. The empire he ruled through cruelty had turned its back on him, and there was nothing left for him to stand on. Marie did not smile, she did not gloat, she simply turned and picked up her mop again, her work unfinished, her humility unbroken. But as she began to walk out of the boardroom, the employees parted for her, stepping aside with quiet respect. The woman they mocked was now the woman they followed in. The weeks that followed, Richard resigned, his name tarnished, his empire weakened. But the company did not fall, it rebuilt under new hands, guided by lessons he could never teach. And though Mary did not seek a throne or a title, her name spread quietly through the halls as the woman who saved them, the woman who carried dignity. Where none was given, Mary continued her life as she always had, raising her daughter with love, working with steady hands. But now, when she walked the halls, there was no laughter at her back, only silence filled with respect and admiration. The same broom she once carried like a weight now felt like a crown of honor. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Mary stood by the window of her small apartment, Lily at her side. She looked at the skyline of the city glowing golden in the fading light. Lily asked softly, "Mama, are you happy now?" Mary smiled faintly and whispered, "Happiness is not about what they see, it is about knowing your worth, even when others do not. And today I know my worth, and so do they." The world had mocked her, the halls had laughed at her, the CEO had humiliated her, but in the end she stood unbroken, and through her courage she turned their laughter into silence, their cruelty into respect, and their arrogance into shame. She proved that no one is truly invisible, and no one should ever be underestimated. And so her story closed, not with bitterness, but with dignity. The maid they mocked had taken down the CEO, and in doing so she left behind a lesson that would echo through those glass walls forever. The end.